Just a thanks to everyone who's already connected. We'll just give everyone a couple more moments to join in and we'll start the webinar shortly. Well, welcome everybody. I'd like to begin this webinar by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we're meeting today. For me, I'm on the land of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We recognise that these have always been lands where learning has taken place by storytelling and through the sharing of experiences. And we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And we approach today's webinar in that spirit of learning from each other through storytelling and the sharing of experiences. My name's Anthony, and on behalf of CIM, I want to welcome you to today's webinar. Today's webinar builds on our previous one about preparing for the 2025 NABERS requirements for government leases. And today we're going to take a practical look at achieving that headline requirement of a 5.5-star NABERS energy rating. Our expert panel today is going to share some strategies for buildings that are at different stages. There are those that are already meeting that target. There are some that are almost there, but not quite. And there are those who need a little bit more improvement. We did actually have a fourth panelist planned for today, but unfortunately they've had to pull out at the last moment due to some unforeseen circumstances. But that panelist, if you were looking forward to hearing from her, will be back next time when we have one of our future webinars. So let's just kick things off. By way of introduction, our three panelists for today are Zoe Baker, the sector lead for the office at NABERS, Ed Cotter, who some of you may have heard on previous webinars with us, is the Director of Strategic Sustainability at JLL. And we've got Howie Mann, who's the VP of Product at CIM, our host for today. And CIM is a market-leading analytics provider. If you have any questions for our panelists today, once we get things going, please feel free to use the Q&A function in the webinar software to send those through. It's really helpful for us if you let us know who the question is for. So if you've got a specific question for either Howie, Zoe or Ed, just please make that clear in your question and we'll make sure that we direct it appropriately. If we get so many questions that we can't keep up with them through the whole session, we will actually bank them up and try to answer them afterwards as best we can. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Howie, who's going to walk us through some slides around net zero in government ops strategy as it relates to property, and he's going to comment a little bit on the market progress that he's been seeing through CIM. So thanks, Howie.
Awesome. Thanks, Anthony. Share my screen, get a thumbs up from you if you can see my screen. Awesome. Okay, great. Thank you everyone for attending and taking a lunch out to listen to us. So the big changes are coming. I think you've heard a lot about this for a while now, but it's definitely landing. In the next 3 months, we're going to see probably the biggest shift in the market that we've seen in the last 18 years. And it's all to do with the net zero and government operations strategy. So just a quick recap of what is coming down the line and what this is all about. As part of the Australian federal government's net zero and government operations strategy, they're committed to reaching net zero by 2030. Practically, what does that mean? The biggest change is happening in the 1st of July 2025, meaning new government leases have to basically lift their minimum leasing NABERS Energy requirement from 4.5 to 5.5. This is a big shift up that's coming, and it's definitely coming in. Now, why does it matter? Government employs over 15% of the Australian workforce. They're also the largest office tenant in the country. So what they do actually matters. That's point one. Point two is that currently, because this lift is so high, the vast majority of government leases today do not meet those requirements. So when it comes to meeting the renewal, times for the renewal, they're either going to have to be in a building that meets those requirements or they'll be looking elsewhere. This has serious implications for owners and operators in the market. Let's double click and have a look what those actual changes are. So the previous policy that was in place from 2006 across the federal government was minimum 4.5-star NABERS energy requirement. And that really caused a seismic shift. If we look back in the history of the Australian sustainability arena and office arena, we saw a lot of big demand for getting NABERS Energy rated and a huge uplift in the industry of meeting that requirement. And now the government's basically upping the game even more and really forcing the industry and bring them on this journey. So from 1st of July, any new leases entered into 4 or more years that are greater than 1,000 square meters will have to have a minimum 5.5 NABERS Energy rating. There's some additional requirements in there as well. They're also requiring NABERS Energy tenancy rating of 5.5. There'll be green lease schedules that are still required, electricity tenant metering is required, and there's also rules for new construction activity as well. Also, what's not mandated in terms of what the actual rating is, but there's also, they'll be looking at considering other ratings in the building as well, including NABERS water, indoor environment, and waste. So a lot of changes actually coming into place. Now, practically, what does that mean? It's a big shift. So going from 4.5 to 5.5, we're talking about a 38% improvement in energy efficiency, and what arguably already has been a big lift from what we were at before. For buildings that are at 5, so already above the minimum requirement that's currently in place to get to 5.5, we're talking about a 25% improvement in energy efficiency. So these aren't small gains, and we'll obviously in the panel talk about some of the strategies you can achieve throughout the talk today. So these are steep hurdles, and they will require a combination of things depending on where you're sitting on that spectrum. Some things can be done without any CapEx, some things can be done with basically operationalizing sustainability, improving processes in place. Other buildings may be forced to actually go and do upgrades to basically meet this new requirement. So that's the number I want to leave everyone with. If you're at 4.5 to 5.5, we're talking roughly upwards of north of 35% improvement energy efficiency you have to achieve. If you're at 5 to 5.5, it's a 25%. And obviously, if you're above 5.5, well, now there's a very, very strong incentive to maintain that high energy rating going forward. From when we last gave this presentation, well, where is the market at today? So currently over a third of rated assets are meeting the 5.5 star NABERS Energy requirement. That's been an increase of 6% that we've seen since we last gave this update. But what this means is a vast majority of assets are still falling below that 5.5 star rating. So remember, it's a big jump coming from 4.5 all the way up to 5.5. I think a lot of people were expecting the federal government to match what the state governments are doing. So the state government requirement is 5, basically across New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland have a minimum 5-star energy rating, but federal is now a lot higher. And there's an expectation that state governments will probably follow the lead of the federal government as well. So that's probably going to be the new standard. Now, what I haven't really shown here is the bifurcation in the market that we've seen. So what that means is the distribution of highly rated energy assets is different amongst different owners. So across the tier 1 A REITs and the office REITs, the bigger players in the market, the Charter Halls, the Lendlease, the GPTs, they've gone on this journey. They've been expecting this to happen many years in advance, and they've already been on this sustainability journey. So across the tier 1 office asset REITs, over 40% of their rated stock is already compliant with a 5.5 star NABERS Energy rating. That is almost double that of the non-tier 1 players. So what we're going to see is we're expecting to see a flight to premium assets and a flight to sustainable assets as well. So a lot of the premium players well ahead on this journey. A lot of the people outside the tier 1s have a lot more to do and invest in to basically meet the market needs. As I mentioned in the first slide, what we're seeing today is the government comes out with a report every, I think, 3 to 4 years. The latest report actually detailed out their compliance with the new NABERS Energy rating based on their current leases. So I mentioned before, 85% of government leases currently are not compliant. They're in buildings that don't meet the minimum 5.5 star target. And we're expecting a big number of leases coming up for renewal and expiry over the next few years. So as I mentioned, this bifurcation of this market that I mentioned before, come renewal time, a lot of the federal government tenants will be having to look for new leases that meet this requirement. And if the current building doesn't meet it, they're going to have to look elsewhere. And currently, the people leading the market right now are in the tier 1 office asset REITs. So we're expecting that shift to continue. I'll pause there. There's a lot more to kind of go through. We're happy to touch on a bit more, but that's just a quick summary of where we're at in the market today. Back to you, Anthony.
Thanks so much, Howie. That was super interesting. That jump from 5 to 5.5, that's not a small jump. When you talk about that being 25%, that's a pretty massive leap that people have got to make on what on paper might look like incremental, but it's a lot more than just a small incremental change. We're going to jump into our panel discussion. We're going to start by looking at a bit of practical advice, particularly for buildings that are already at or just above that target of 5.5 neighbours. Before we do that, if you do have any questions, please feel free to send them through using the Q&A. If you've got any questions for Howie in particular after his presentation, feel free to plug them through, and just make sure that we know who it's for when you send your question. So let's get started. Ed, you've been involved with a lot of premium assets and that have maintained some pretty high ratings at the 5.5 and above. What are some of the best practices for protecting and maintaining those high ratings?
I think it's really important to have an understanding, and Zoe will be able to shed further insights into that, but having an understanding on your asset and the building typology and the age of the asset and the overall opportunities associated with that. For those that are in the 5.5 and above, they're well positioned, but to be able to maintain that, there's a few fundamentals that they need to keep across. First of all, it's really, really important having a great building asset and facility management team on board. All right, they're the ones that will be responsible for helping to ensure that they're optimizing the performance of that building moving forward. The next thing I'd say is making sure that you're across any changes or any updates to NABERS and the broader suite of NABERS tools, whether that be energy, water, indoor environment quality, etc., etc. We know that the calculation methodology is being updated. We also know that they're taking out some of the requirements in terms of the rating associated with the purchasing or procurement of green power. So it's really important to be on point with each of those particular issues. I'd also like to emphasize the need to collaborate, to go in with a very, very much a partnership approach when working with potential tenants or corporates or government agencies in this case, which is the focus of today. And I think having a sharing or data sharing and information sharing arrangement really helps maximize the performance of your asset moving forward. I won't go on too much more, but one thing that I think is really important, we can loop back to that later on, is having a good understanding of who your target audience is and developing a business case to ensure that when you're looking at doing, whether it be operational tweaks or CapEx upgrades and looking for investment, or as part of that process, you've got a really, really strong case to put forward for any type of investment moving forward.
Thanks for that, Ed. We've got our first audience question, which is always a bit of a moment of trepidation for our panelists because we're not quite sure what's going to come next. But this one's directed to Zoe. So Zoe, if the government tenant occupies the whole building, does the 5.5 energy rating have to be a whole building rating instead of a base building rating?
Great question. My understanding is that it's the requirement is always about the base building. So that should be what's being required, but doing a whole building or doing a co-assess where you're doing the base building and that tenant space as a separate rating is also a really good way, going back to Ed's point before around treating this as a partnership between the tenant and the landlord or tenants. That capacity to get the tenancy space rated and help them understand their performance, and they might have that rating requirement as well. And see that as an opportunity, I'd say. My understanding is it is base building though, so hopefully that answers that one.
Thanks, Zoe. And was there anything you wanted to add to Ed's comments there about, from your experience, around maintaining that really high 5.5 to 6 rating?
I think everything Ed said was bang on. It's really about not treating those higher performing buildings as set and forget, right? Once they're there, you can't just go, okay, that's done. We don't need to worry about that building anymore. It's continuously checking in on how it's going. And the opportunities, like we've just mentioned around having green lease in situ with those tenants, so that data sharing is easier, so that you're working together on other things that you want to achieve in the building. And is that going beyond? Is that looking at things like indoor environment, and is that again, being built into the green lease. So there's more kind of partnership opportunity about how you're working with those tenants, which is a really great way to have a good relationship with them, especially when it might feel like there's this big imposition of these requirements, but those are also opportunities to either bring them along on the journey if they're not already there, or bring them solutions that they might need in other parts of their reporting that you as the landlord can really help them achieve, whether that's a NABERS rating or other data, or looking at things like indoor environment.
Sorry, I've just had one of my Govy contacts send me a text, and
Yeah.
they just said if they occupy the whole building, it's a whole building rating that's required.
Okay, perfect. That's a great clarification from them. Yeah, we at NABERS don't set the legislation; we're just the tool to meet it. So that's a great clarification from them. Thanks, anonymous texter.
Oh, Ed, a question just come in that's being directed specifically at you. It's assumed that a higher NABERS rating will equal a higher rental premium. Is that the case?
Look, I'd say there's a very strong correlation. It's not guaranteed. I want to give a little bit of background behind that. So aside from some of the WOAG and government requirements around NABERS and electrification and whatnot, just some few stats here. First of all, right, there is definitely a clear demand for those 5.5 and 6-star NABERS rated buildings that are electrified, that are decarbonised. I think that's really important to understand. If you're not targeting, and this goes back to my comment before around understanding your target client or your potential corporate tenant. So within the CBDs of Sydney and Melbourne, at the moment, 74% in Sydney of corporate tenants actually have some sort of net zero carbon strategy or target. 64% within Melbourne also have a similar target in place. Now, in Melbourne and Sydney, it's really interesting. All right, there is a clear demand within Melbourne. There's over 2 million square meters of demand for 5.5-star plus NABERS rated commercial office space that is electrified. All right, out of that, there's only a 43% supply at the moment meeting that requirement. So there's a massive gap. Within Sydney, that's even worse. There's over 4 million in terms of demand, and there's a gap of about 84%. So going back to your point before, I think we do see, and look, the team at JLL and Andrew Ballantyne hates this comment, but what I think we are seeing is a definite flight to quality, and therefore, as a result of that, a premium for that quality in itself.
It sounds like it's the old story of product scarcity impacting product price.
Totally. Higher yield, higher rents. Yep. Ticking all those boxes. Absolutely.
And some of those stats, those are quite scary stats. If you're out there looking for a property to move into that meets those requirements, there just aren't enough of those buildings to go around at the moment.
No, there's a good piece of work that we did in the third quarter last year called The Real Melbourne Narrative, that goes into a little bit of detail around what's happening in Melbourne in particular. Yes, there are relatively high vacancy rates within the CBD and the surrounding areas, close to 19 to 20% in some instances, but that's really associated with those, I guess, assets that are closer to that 4-star NABERS rating or below. It's those at the top end that are actually performing quite well, but there's obviously an undersupply in that case.
And just before we move on to our next topic of some practical advice for building owners and operators and tenants who are just below that target, Howie, a specific question for you. Can solar PV that's catering for the office be utilised to offset the energy consumption of a base building to get to 5.5?
Yes. Short answer is yes. Solar PV reduces the consumption of what the base building is doing. What NABERS measures is ultimately what the building consumption actually is. So by installing solar, it reduces your electricity consumption. It's definitely a strategy that's implemented in office assets. It's probably more effective in retail assets just because of the surface area of the roof. It kind of depends on how much solar area you have. So you have a tiny building, really, really long, tall, with a little bit of solar, you're not going to get much benefit out of that.
Okay, thanks for that. So let's move on to some practical advice for building owners, operators and tenants who are sort of just below that 5.5 target. you know, a lot of the market falls within the good range of, you know, 4 to 5. What strategic steps would you recommend to help the owners and managers of these 4 to 5 rated buildings or offices to close the gap so that they can get those government tenants in there by July?
I'd look at the market, and especially those 4 to 5, there's probably different areas in terms of different classifications of how they're performing. There's probably those assets that, you know, as we mentioned earlier, they just need minor tweaks to their operation, a bit of optimization work and whatnot. Then there's those assets that just sit below that probably need some sort of upgrade or refurbishment and need the business case built to be able to do that. I'd highly recommend going down the path of doing something like a net zero carbon pathways assessment, or putting together an action plan to understand exactly what your CapEx options are for upgrades and what the savings and benefits associated with that might be. Then there's those assets that might be a little bit older, that might not be performing quite at that top end, or even for that matter, close to the 4-star NABERS rating. And they may need like a complete repositioning. And that in itself requires substantial capital investment, and building the business case for that, it might take quite a while to be able to do that. And you might need to have an overarching engagement strategy with your existing tenants to ensure that you have the demand, and that's something that they want to go through. And then at the back end of that are those stranded assets that, I mean, we were at Transform last week having this conversation with several of my colleagues, and some of them are just saying that there's those assets out there that just aren't even worthwhile trying to reposition or refurbish. You just need to knock it down and start from scratch again. I think it's understanding where your asset sits, age of the asset, performance of the asset, and whether or not that actual investment via that business case is worthwhile, and then utilizing that to do simple things, and ensure that you've got your partners on board as part of that process. I think Howie and Zoe will be able to add a little bit more to that in terms of what they're seeing from their perspective in terms of the performance of getting from 4 to 5 stars. But I think Howie's stats highlighted that quite nicely in terms of the energy performance improvement that you can see as a result of that.
I guess just, you know, Howie, when you hear what Ed's just said there, and some of the answers and so forth we've had from the audience questions, where do technology data and analytics fit into all this? What's their role in helping organisations or building owners actually reach that target of 5.5 or above?
I think it kind of touches on what Ed mentioned in the beginning when we asked the question of, you know, what it means to maintain a high-performing asset and just having a great facility management team. And I think that's probably one that's the most overlooked part of all of this. So everything we're presenting today, with all these new regulations coming in with net zero, we're talking about carrots and sticks. And these are very, very powerful things. These are all about getting the right incentives, getting the right people aligned. And the net zero in government operations can be both a big stick and a big carrot. Right now, it's a stick, right? Everyone's terrified. How do I make sure I can keep my federal government tenant without them leaving me? But other people are going, hey, it's an opportunity for me to go market to my government agency next door to say, come over to my building. Same time, we're hearing a lot about green financing in place to basically incentivize people to hit these targets and get more incentives. I think one thing the industry is not talking enough about, or not having enough focus on, is on the fishing rod, if you will, on the tools and the technology, and forgetting about the people who actually run those buildings. So for us, technology, a big piece of that is how can technology be used to operationalize sustainability for the people who actually run and operate those buildings. And I think that's incredibly critical here, to be thinking about. If you're trying to get a 10% savings, if you're trying to get a 25% savings, we see so many examples of, you can put all CapEx upgrades and everything in place, but if someone is not, basically has left a chiller running overnight, doesn't have the right programming strategies in place, you blow everything out just through lack of action or oversight on the teams. So kind of our opinion from the technology side of things is not just limited technology. It's kind of our entire ethos of how we operate at CIM. It's almost a three-pronged approach. It's, you know, making sure that we have the right data and we have the right tools for the people to take action, and ultimately getting it in the hands of the right people is really important. There's the saying that I always say with technology is that, you know, we can use it and look at can look at all the data and gather it and look at it for the next 10 years. But if we're not taking any action, not doing anything about it, then it's a completely pointless exercise.
I'd 100% agree with that point. And one of the really exciting things that we've seen with technology and platforms like CIM, is that there can be a built-in NABERS result calculation. So rather than waiting a year until you do your certified rating, you're seeing that result, and you can see when something is shifting, you can see when something has changed, when something's gone wrong. But you can also, in that kind of just below how we're going to push them just below meeting that target, you can play around with some of those operational changes that both Ed and Howie have mentioned, those tweaks and adjustments to your operations that can actually have a really great performance improvement. And because if you've got the best platforms out there, they will show that change kind of live as you're making them. And so you can really play around with it. So that technology is a super important tool, but yeah, we need to empower everyone who's got access to those portals to understand what they can and can't do. And also, if those adjustments, going back to that green lease and partnership position, are those adjustments, if that's to HVAC or other things that impact the tenant, is the allowance in the green lease that we can work together to make those adjustments.
I just want to, just for the audience out there, we're getting more questions than we can handle at the moment, which is a great problem to have. So we're really thankful. Please keep sending your questions through. If you send them through anonymously, it's going to make it a bit hard for us to follow up after the webinar to come back to you with answers. So we're happy to read the questions that we used. Obviously, we'll read out anonymously. But if you do need us to come back and follow up with you, please make sure we've got some contact details or a name or an email address, so we can follow up with you after the webinar for some of those questions. We've been talking mainly about NABERS Energy at the moment. Maybe Zoe, what about water, waste ratings? Is there any demand from that side of things as well?
100%. What we do see is that doing the energy and water ratings together is really quick and easy. Most of the office-based building ratings that do energy, most of them do water at the same time. So that's there. It's just not a requirement yet, but it is really useful and gives you good sort of, again, operational change and financial changes, savings that can be made. Waste is another question. It's definitely of interest to tenants. Energy is obviously super important. It's obviously really important to meet this legislation, but waste people kind of get. It's tangible. They can touch and feel it. So if that's a discussion that needs to open with the occupants in the building, having that waste performance data alongside the energy, I think that's a great, I used to call it the gateway drug to get people excited about the energy performance of the building as well. It gives you something that they can really impact. So those other rating options and those other measurement options, they're really useful to use in tandem.
That's awesome. Just one other question we've got. Oh, sorry, Ed, were you about to say something?
No, of course not.
No, that's not. Okay. Just one other quick question's come through, and I think this is a Zoe question once again, but we'll see who jumps in first. What's the main difference between NABERS and Green Star?
That is a great question. So Green Star has a performance rating that does look at energy performance. There are a variety of differences, and the GBCA have a great explanation of the difference on their website. So I'd say go to them and look at the breakdown. But people who have done that Green Star fit out, so that's the kind of shining star in the Green Star tool, they might stick with Green Star Performance because they've already gone down that pathway. Regardless, the NABERS Energy rating forms part of your Green Star submission. So you can use that as the shortcut to say, don't worry about double checking all of your the energy data that we're putting in. We're just putting in the NABERS report, and it's kind of this has been checked already portion of Green Star. So they work in tandem. Then we're best friends, and if you want a bit more of a breakdown, there's a bit of a checklist on their website.
There's a really
Awesome.
nice alignment between NABERS energy rating and especially Green Star Performance, and as one of the pathways, it is that NABERS pathway for achieving the energy credits and the points associated with that. So that's a really nice alignment. It has taken a while, but it's great that it's there right now, and it's something, so it makes it so easy now.
And we've also
And
seen, I think, a lot of overlap as well in all the different rating systems. So like even with NABERS indoor environment, while it's not mandatory, actually can contribute to the well rating, which is becoming more globally, internationally popular. So, I mean, to not talk up Zoe, but like NABERS is mandatory. Like, at least in the office asset, you kind of have to do it, but you can reuse a lot of the ratings that you're getting for other rating systems.
Totally.
Thanks, guys.
So Howie, question from our audience. Do you expect large corporates to also move to that 5.5 minimum requirement?
Kind of already seeing, maybe Ed can talk to this as well, but we've definitely seen examples of with some of our customers where anchor tenants have they moved to that years ago for a lot of their premium assets and a lot of their HQs in particular. They've been tying that into their green leases of 5.5. But Ed, have you seen that?
Yeah, totally. I think, look, it's whether or not it's about a NABERS rating or if it's, for example, a European or international corporate that's looking to find your office space in Sydney or Melbourne, there are certain requirements that obviously need to be ticked. Really, really strong kilowatt hour performance per square meter. We're looking at around 70 kilowatt hours as some of the targets that have been set. I know that at the moment, ING are looking for that sort of performance metric. Obviously, Dutch, European, corporate, but they're bringing that down here, and that's going to help drive performance standards. Other things to bear in mind: top quality ratings, whether that's BRAM or Green Star or LEED, or that sort of leads into that 5.5, 6-star NABERS rating as well. Finally, it has to be electrified and also has to be powered by clean energy, completely clean energy. So they're really strong targets. It's really interesting you talk about the green leasing component. We saw quite recently, WSP were looking to relocate about 7,000 square meters in Sydney. They're looking for that office space up there. They've got pretty strong SBTI targets, which means that they can't purchase any offsets as part of that within a certain period of time. And we help them negotiate with Brookfield a break clause in their lease. So in the event that Brookfield don't actually do upgrades to the building to help decarbonize it and make it completely electric by 2030, WSP actually have the ability to leave and find another location if they'd like to do so. So that's the stick side of things. I think, as you mentioned before, it's a combination, and I think these ratings definitely do provide a bit of a carrot, but that is a good example of a stick being applied.
So there's a great phrase. Sorry, you go ahead.
The short answer is yes, it's coming, and Ed is representing them.
It's really interesting. Howie's founder, Dave Walsh, often talks about the carrot and the stick, but he throws a third one in there of the tambourine. He goes, you can either belt people to go towards their target, or you can incentivize them, or you can actually go there first and lead them, which is his tambourine. He goes, walking along with the tambourine and people follow you. So he goes, there are different ways to go about this.
Sounds like he's a bit of a Bob Dylan fan, but yeah, anyway.
Look, I wasn't going to go there, but yeah. Just one, I'm going to do one more audience question before we jump into our last topic, which is around helping organisations that are well below the target. And this is an open question to anyone who's out there, so any one of the three on the panel. Are you seeing any initiatives to drive pre-commitments on planned developments? Development pipeline is slower than it needs to be. Is there a pathway to support and drive confidence in the market? Yeah, go Zoe. You look like you're bursting to tell us.
NABERS has a tool called Commitment Agreement and another tool called Agreement to Rate, and those are both design stage commitments to commitment agreement is to achieve a particular NABERS rating once the building is in operation. And because it's gone through basically a review of the NABERS performance on the design, you can talk about that in your marketing. You can talk about that as a result that you're aiming for. And so then once the building's kind of properly occupied and operating, there's an expectation that you will be meeting that, and it gives that's a bit of a stick. But the carrot is that you've got that number to advertise at the design stage, and that's hopefully something that's attracting those tenants even when you haven't started building.
Awesome. So let's just move on to our third topic. So we've talked about buildings that are already at that 5.5 or above rating and what they need to do, and that was very much a story about not treating this as a project, but treating it as an ongoing program where you continue to maintain things and look for opportunities to keep, not just to keep your rating, but to boost your rating even from 5.5 to above that. And we've talked a little bit about some practical advice for people who are, on their way to that 5.5 but aren't quite there. Let's talk a little bit about buildings that are, are struggling to reach that 5.5, the ones that are well below that target. Zoe, what guidance do you have for the buildings that are well below that target that need significant improvement? How should landlords approach capital upgrades to build or to improve their competitiveness and sustainability?
Yeah, well, Ed already mentioned really important, strategic look across your portfolio. And in some cases, some of those sites are not necessarily going to be worth doing the upgrades on. I think that here is really where it is an opportunity. We've got data available. We've got very sophisticated ways to work out exactly what's dragging us down in that performance. There is a wealth of knowledge in the industry, so it's really about not reinventing the wheel, copy the homework of other buildings that have faced a similar problem. I really think the availability of data and the availability of professional advice in the market that's the thing to lean on. Really be analytical about your buildings, about what exactly can and can't be upgraded. The good thing about these sticks in the market is that kind of reduces the decision maker resistance to making those upgrades. If you've got a really clear business case that this is going to, NABERS has reverse calculators, so you can work out exactly how many kilowatt hours you're going to need to save to move that dial. And you can do that very detailed. This particular upgrade is going to get us this much kilowatt hour improvement. It's going to cost us this much in capex. We're going to need it by this date. And it's really it creates that very strong business case for those upgrades. But I think that's also a way to see that as an opportunity for us in the sustainability space to transition that into a really solid business decision. And I know that the property market works in that way, that these are things that are just going to need to be spent. This is budget that's going to need to be allocated if we're going to get to that point where we're competitive for those tenants that are potentially going to go. So yeah, don't discount the data that's available. And my other tip, as I said before, copy the homework. Other people have been there before and done this stuff. So look around the other buildings to see what can be done.
It's a good lesson. So go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to add to that. I think one person's trash is another person's treasure. And we're seeing many of the funds being driven by investor sentiment and saying, okay, what are you doing with that asset? Right? How are you going to address its performance moving forward? And the fund is making a decision, or the institution that's working with the fund is saying, all right, we're going to keep them, we're going to upgrade them, we're going to reposition these, but we're divesting from this range of assets. So that presents an opportunity for those that may think that they want to then get in there with a good vision for where that asset might be and reposition it and actually get in there and do something quite different and unique. As long as you have a really good business case, the data to back it up, right? And you know exactly who you're pitching it at, right? That presents an opportunity. So while some of the larger corporates might be moving out, right, that does present an opportunity for those other smaller investors or investment groups to get involved in that process and actually take advantage of what I see as a cycle of potential upgrades that will occur over the next 10 to 15 years.
And that leads us beautifully, Ed, into a question we've had from the audience. So we've got one of the members of the audience has said that in their experience with similar REITs aiming to improve their NABERS ratings on a budget, it can be a challenge to balance sustainability goals within financial constraints. Are there any strategies you've seen that help organisations optimise results without heavy capital investment?
Oh, the last couple of years have been really tough coming out of COVID, especially in the commercial office space. We've seen that dip in the market, a quite substantial dip in the market, and getting access to capital, especially when you don't have that cash available on hand, is really quite tricky. I think going back to that point before, having a business case, presenting that, talking to those institutional investors and including sustainability, including net zero carbon targets, as part of any business case or vision that you have for that asset is a critical point, a critical part of that whole conversation. You're more likely, they're going to have requirements under ASRS, which is the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standard, that they need to meet. And they're more likely to be able to actually lend to those, I guess, asset owners, small asset owners that have that vision that aligns with those requirements than those that don't. And they'll give it a better rate as well as part of that process.
That's a really good point to point out as well, Ed, the access of green finance and the better interest rates that you can tie directly. There's guidance from the finance industry, but most of those big banks have green loan mechanisms, and that can be a huge saving over time. So it's not just a kind of nice to have with sustainability. Having that embedded into the plan can also get you really good financial kind of investment and improvements in the loan rate.
So that was a really interesting point there about, there's some potential benefits in how you finance these sorts of initiatives and projects. But I'm not sure whether this is an Ed or a Zoe. I think maybe this is more of an Ed question, but do you have any insight on what the investment to go from 4.5 to 5.5 is going to cost?
How long is a piece of string?
Yeah, well, it is the piece of string question.
That's I wouldn't like to put a finger on it. I think it depends on the asset, the building type, the location, the market. There's a range of factors behind that. I think what we're seeing is those that want a return on that investment, you need to make the numbers stack up, and you need to look at it quite closely. Howie had some great stats around energy performance going from 4 to 5.5 and 5 to 5.5, and what the requirements were. That's part of the narrative. In terms of cost per square metre, I wouldn't be willing to put my finger on it. I'd have to broadly caveat that. And I think for the purpose of this conversation, come and have a chat with me later, and then we can look at your individual case by case basis.
Yeah, and awesome. I mean that's true on a very statistical basis as well, because NABERS is a benchmark. If you're 4-star for a small building, that's a very different conversation if you're 4-star for a really large office tower. So lean into the professional knowledge in the industry, because we are a leader in global kind of property in terms of improvements, and there's lots of information out there.
It's a great question, though. I'd love to have a simple answer.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not like you can take a 4,000 square metre building and double it for an 8,000 square metre building. The thing's just not that one-to-one or linear relationship that you can have. This is an open question for everybody on the panel. What partnership models can operators or contractors take to optimise buildings? Could this change contract requirements, contracting models? Do you foresee a lot of greenwashing in business cases? Who wants to have a crack at that one?
I mean, I'll leave the partnership model to the others on the panel to add a little bit more. But in terms of the greenwashing conversation, I think that the Australian industry is so robust in very detailed, very certified models of reporting. Not just NABERS, there's lots of other parts where we are just used to. It's got to be third-party verified. So it just removes a little bit of that greenwash sense. Howie, Ed, comments?
Sorry, I think you're spot on. There are many critics of rating tools, certification processes, assessment processes, but they have a position and a place, and that really is to help cut through that greenwashing. I think from a contractor perspective, there's an opportunity to align yourself with performance and have a performance-based contract. It's probably a bit of a risk-based contract, so the higher the rating that you achieve, the greater the payback as part of that process. But it's definitely the case that tools like Greenstar and NABERS help cut through a lot of that greenwashing that's out there, and I think it's a really important point.
It's so I'm just trying to understand the question a bit more. I think it's quite multifaceted, looking at contractors or operators. But if you're thinking operators in terms of facility management organizations, this is something we've commonly seen in the industry, where NABERS performance targets are tied to financial incentives in terms of basically like a bonus or withheld payment in terms of maintaining that. That's quite common, and we see quite a lot. We work with a lot of our partners where they really care about NABERS rating because that's if they get paid by the owner for facility management services. I haven't seen it with contractors, like talking about mechanical BMS or people who are responsible for the consumption in terms of being responsible or held accountable to achieving that target. I think the reason for that is because it's so multifaceted. It's like you can't just have one BMS person be responsible for all of it. It could be dependent on the mechanical contractor. But what we have seen across the contractor industry and a big push that's happening now is this shift towards data-driven maintenance, where performance becomes a byproduct. So shifting away from reactive and plan preventative maintenance and using tools like CIM from an analytics perspective to be taking action, fixing things, fixing energy wastage issues as they happen, and basically holding them accountable for that. Don't fix what ain't broke, don't check what ain't broke, fix what's broken, and that's following data-driven maintenance contracts, following DA19 standards. That's what we're seeing.
Harry, on that note, are you seeing much in the way of AI being more proactive with the operation and maintenance of a building?
In what sense? In terms of direct
providing information or insights into issues that might occur, or performance or trends in the way that the building's being operated, and then how the building management team responds accordingly or utilizes that to actually inform decisions that are made?
Yes, the short answer is yes, and that's basically kind of the bread and butter and core of what we do. The analytics platform that we generate analyzes huge volumes of data and basically identifies the root causes of issues for them to take action. So we're seeing that now entered into contractual obligations with contractors, whereas before it's like, hey, this is a nice tool, maybe you use it. Now it's basically mandated. No, you have to use these AI tools as part of your workflow, because it's just not humanly possible for someone to go and check every single sensor in a building and every single condition. We need to be using algorithms to basically tell us what to fix. So we've definitely seen that trend. We're also seeing increasing appetite, which I didn't see probably a few years ago, is giving more control over this technology to take direct control of the buildings. There was a lot of distrust for that before. So we have technology at CIM that programmatically changes controls. We don't just read from a building, we can actually control directly to it. Ironically, this is technology we developed years ago, and we were just ahead of our time, that people were like, no, don't touch my building. Now they're like, oh, touch my building. Automate it for me.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's the game of AI. I think in general in society, we're about to dip into that trough of disillusionment with AI, but you guys have sort of come out the other side now and are starting to move towards that broader adoption, where people have gone, right, we've gotten through that stage where we didn't trust it. We're now starting to believe that it can actually do things that are useful for us. Just while you've got the talking stick, Howie, I've got a question for you. How important is electrification alongside the NABERS rating improvement?
Oh, this is a pretty great question. So electrification is incredibly important for, in particular, net zero and government operations. There's mandates in there for buildings to be fully electrified as well. This is kind of an interesting journey, because usually what will happen in the immediate stage of electrification, obviously there's huge CapEx work that has to actually be done. The biggest challenge in electrification is really moving from gas boilers to electric heaters and changing everything there. And in the interim, that will actually have a net negative impact, because usually gas is cheaper and it actually has a lower carbon footprint. So it really depends on where you're sourcing your electricity from. So the long-term strategy is ultimately to remove all gas emissions, is to electrify everything, and then obviously offset that or purchase renewables for it. So we're seeing this challenge in the industry of basically when people are doing major refurbs, that's when they're doing it. I think the challenge is going to be more increasingly felt in more the eastern states in Victoria and parts of New South Wales. Queensland's less of a problem because they don't really have gas in the buildings because of the climate. So it becomes less of a problem there, but definitely Victoria is facing that. It's also a huge challenge outside of office in retail assets. I think one thing people haven't really thought through is, you go to Hungry Jack's, you get a flame grill Whopper. What happens if it's not flame grilled anymore? So there's practicalities of being like within food courts and how gas is so dependent there, how we move towards an electrification model there. But in office, it's basically moving from boilers to electric heaters.
I never thought about the impact on a hamburger of all of this, but there you go. Zoe, are there any planned, can you elaborate on any planned updates to the NABERS rating methodology that might affect buildings in that next 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, look, one of them it touched on right at the top of the webinar today, which is around that removal of the green power star rating result calculation. We've just wrapped up this has been something that's been coming for a couple of years. We transitioned to the renewable energy indicator portion of the rating. So again, that's to that electrification question, representing all of the energy types that are coming into the building as a percentage. And so we moved to that. The consultation at the time was, let's keep that star rating with green power on the report for the next year and a half. We've just wrapped up another consultation. So that will be coming out. That won't be a number you can rely on for this rating. And that's, that's something that we know that some of this government contracting stuff has been relying on, and we're just going to need to look at other ways to meet that star rating result. And overall, the industry have come back and said, yeah, we're on board with that. So that's the way that it'll go forward. There are other updates to the benchmark that happen regularly, including responsiveness to the renewable energy in the grid, those kind of calculations that happen over time. So to keep up to date with the NABERS news, just keep in touch with us, I guess. And we always try to come out, if there's a question that we need industry input on, we try to come out to building managers, to industry bodies, to get as much information as possible about how this is going to impact the industry. But we also, we're keeping abreast with other policy and things that are happening and how NABERS will interact with those and what we need to adjust to. So it's a two-way street, really. We will try and get that information out as much as possible, but our door is also open to questions and feedback around, what the industry see coming and what we can do better to assist all of you out there in this sector to meet the things that you need to achieve or to go beyond it. So, yeah, watch out for the news from us. And hopefully all of the suppliers in the market are also up to date with it. So you should be able to go to your consultants, go to your NABERS assessors and get that information too.
Our time is coming to an end very quickly. We've only got about 8 minutes left in our scheduled time. I just wanted to throw one quick question to Ed, hopefully quick, and then we'll go to Zoe for one question. Then I'm going to ask Howie to wrap us up with some information that he's got prepared on a couple of slides. So firstly, for you, Ed, what do you think is going to happen to stock that becomes redundant? Old office assets in Canberra, for example, that are B and C grade.
How old are they? That's the question that comes to mind straight away. If they're older than 50 years, then there's a large potential that they might be knocked down. But on the flip side to that, what about the embodied carbon associated with it? So there's a really interesting conversation in this space, and it's been driven a lot by NABERS and mandatory building disclosures, but also ASRS and some of their outcomes in terms of the climate risk disclosures or climate financial related disclosure requirements that many of the corporates are going to see coming into effect over the next 3 to 4 years. It is a really interesting scenario. We're seeing many of these larger corporates starting to look at scope 3 very, very, very closely, and that's a key part of their consideration. In fact, instead of going down the path of doing a knockdown and rebuild or a new development, there's one client that we've been working with that's looking for about 30,000 square meters of space, and they're seriously considering a repositioning or refurbishment of an existing asset because of those implications associated with scope 3 and some of their investor requirements. So I think it depends on the asset owner. I think it depends on the individual asset, the age of the asset. I think what we'll see is that many of these stranded assets do end up becoming knocked down, but then there's other ones that will definitely tick the boxes from a fundamentals perspective and have the opportunity to be repositioned.
So, Zoe, let's just quickly dive into a little bit for buildings that are well below the target. What guidance do you have for buildings that are well below the target that need significant improvement? How should landlords approach capital upgrades to improve their competitiveness and sustainability?
Yeah, they've just got to make that analysis, really, really deep analysis on it. Make that decision, to Ed's point, around whether this is something we can pull from a low performance to a higher. And there are very, there's some really nice examples in the market of where that big change has happened. And if it's an embodied carbon discussion, is that something that we want to keep the shell but do a really massive refurbishment? And again, there's some really cool examples of where big parts of the building have been kept intact, but a really massive refurbishment has happened. So it's a business decision around, what you're going to put in, whether, to Ed's point, that's a repositioning and saying, okay, this is either the building needs upgrading or we need to talk about it in a different way. But yeah, the data's there. The ability to do that analysis and look at all the different pathways is definitely out there.
Final question for Howie. I've been told you might have a couple of slides around some initiatives, particularly around CapEx. Can you talk to us a bit with portfolios that have got assets with various rating profiles? So, with things like age, different asset life cycles, what advice do you have for managing the diverse portfolio and prioritizing improvement works?
So I might share, I'll share a few slides here and see if everyone kind of have some images that might communicate this better if you can see my screen. So the first part of everything that we need to do is have an understanding, which I think people don't have, at least I didn't have when I first entered this industry, is where is your energy actually being used, right? We're talking about this energy 20%, but practically we're going to take effect, where is it? And a lot of people don't recognize that it's really this giant bucket here in terms of HVAC, ventilation, chill water plant, heat rejection boilers. This is 70% of your base building energy consumption here. So whether you're doing upgrades, whether you're doing optimization, whether you're having better operation, decisions made here have a huge flow and impact in terms of what your actual rating is. And then the remainder, where a lot of people, I think, get a lot of focus on, is on lighting and LEDs and all that. Like, there's actually not much to milk there, and it doesn't consume a huge amount of energy. So just implant in people's minds, that's where the bulk of your energy is actually coming in. Now, in terms of the path to actually getting there, this is the kind of visual I want to kind of highlight to people. So that's what we mentioned before. To kind of the hurdle rate that people are looking at is anywhere from 25 to 40%, depending if you're 4.5 or 5, getting to that 5.5 figure. So if you're starting here at this point and you need to basically achieve a 25 to 40% hurdle savings, it's multifaceted in terms of how you want to approach that. I'll go through briefly each of these, but I think where a lot of people get stuck is almost like focusing too much on here. They get too caught up on lighting, structural changes, major upgrades, solar, and the lead time in doing the business case and analysis can be huge. The payback is very not there. And I think a big piece that people forget about when looking at business cases or ROI is the opportunity cost of time, right? So if you're going to do a structural upgrade, that could be an 18-month project. You just don't have the time to do it, sourcing your LEDs. So the first recommendation for a lot of sites is actually, I'll say a cheat one before I even get into any of this, and Zoe will probably not like me saying this, but it's exclusion metering is like the first thing that you should be doing is like, are you being counted correctly? And so remember, like NABERS Energy is calculating base fuel consumption. We see so many buildings that actually they're going, well, I'm unfairly being penalized because this is the tenant consumption, this is the car park. Well, ensure you get that separately metered and have accurate data. And then you could naturally get half a star by just deducting what doesn't belong to you in the first instance. So that's number one, is ensuring that, hey, is what I'm being counted for actually all attributed to me? Different to whole building, but for base building, that's the number one thing. And then that can probably give you the highest payback. After you've done that step, the next one very much is around optimization. Optimization will give you your fastest payback with the shortest period of time and limited capex. As I said before, here's where your consumption is actually taking place. So what does that actually mean when we talk optimization? That means all that fancy equipment that you purchased 5 years ago, all those VSD upgrades, all those things for energy sustainability, are they actually being used? The analogy I like to give is, a lot of people, you're installing all these solar panels and you didn't take the cover off. It's the same equivalent explanation for a lot of that HVAC equipment. So ensuring that the equipment you already have is optimizing to its best energy efficiency. That will give you the best payback because it's immediate. You don't have to wait for anything there. And the next piece is, though, depending on where you're at, you may have to get bigger savings. And that's where you need to look at HVAC upgrades and be able to put that business case together. And that's where technology can also play a big piece to ensure that you're purchasing the right size equipment, that you're purchasing the equipment that you don't have, that you're right sizing it based on demand conditions in the building, not just going out and buying the biggest, fanciest chiller in the world that might actually worsen your energy performance because it will consume more energy. And then you kind of get to the other ones. Now, this is very much representative of an office building. Obviously, with different assets, this profile looks different, right? If you're a huge retail shopping center with a huge amount of solar, you could basically be generating energy back to the grid. That makes a lot of sense for you to do. But in the vast majority of instances of office buildings, this is kind of the path that I'd recommend. Get your metering done to get all the exclusions, optimize the assets that you already have, then consider the ROI payback analysis of what you're doing. And you don't have to wait to do a huge business case for every single item before you get going on any of these.
Thanks for that, Howie. We've just hit the end of our time. So we're going to wrap up. I want to thank our three panelists today, Zoe, Howie, and Ed. We didn't have a huge number of questions prepared ahead of this for this webinar, but we've probably got 3 times as many at least that have come in from our audience. And I know that there's quite a few that we haven't quite got to that we'll try to get to afterwards. But I want to thank Zoe, Howie, and Ed for their enthusiasm, for their expertise, and for just being great troopers at taking a lot of stuff without notice and being able to answer those questions so succinctly and with so much industry knowledge and background. So thank you guys for your time and for your input. When we finish up, for our audience, there'll be a short survey that pops up at the end of the webinar. Please complete that. It really helps us guide what we do for our future webinars in terms of making sure we hit the right topics, present them in a way that is useful to you as our audience. And with that, I just want to thank everybody for their time, and I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks all.
Thanks.